Hi, Dr. Patrick Gentempo here, and thank you for joining us on our YouTube channel. We have great content in store for you. I'm so excited to be here with you, and let's jump right into it. How did this whole thing get started? What's the genesis of it?
So you have to go back to the roots of chemical warfare, basically. So
Chemical warfare?
Chemical warfare, yes. So, it was used in World War I, and in World War II there was big advances in chemical warfare. And Monsanto was already making PCBs, and they were already making nuclear weapons. During the World War II, they made nuclear weapons, they made polystyrene. So they had this expertise at killing things with chemicals. Like that's an expertise that they had.
Right.
And there's a pretty long list, DDT, so they're making these pesticides.
Did they make Agent Orange?
Agent Orange, yeah, that was that was a Monsanto product at one point during the Vietnam War period. So you have this expertise at killing things, and that expertise after World War II got directed towards increasing farm productivity through having these chemicals that were originally designed to, can kill insects and can kill other things. So that's kind of the genesis of Monsanto is certainly involved, but other chemical companies getting involved in this area that's nicely named crop science, but it's really the application of very toxic compounds to crops. And the benefits are that they do kill bugs and they do kill weeds. So that's a net benefit to the farmer. When you then extrapolate that so that it's every crop, that's when the unintended consequences can start. And I remember this. I went to a meeting in the mid-90s, a strategy session presentation on their strategy that Monsanto had. It wasn't confidential, I think it was just a public seminar. It was in Chicago, and they talked about how they were going to get rid of their petroleum-based chemical fertilizer and industrial chemicals business and focus instead specifically on genetically modified seeds that were resistant to their pesticides. And I came up, it was a fairly small group, small enough that you could come up to the speaker afterwards, and I said, hey, there'll be riots in the streets if you do this. Like, you should keep the chemical business. Like, why would you risk your entire business on the premise that the American public is going to take, with lying down, genetically modified foods specifically designed to match up to your pesticides? Like, that's not going to happen. And I was completely wrong. Obviously, if you fast forward now, it's 90+% of the soybean, canola, cotton, corn crop in this country are now GM, genetically modified seeds. Most of them are designed to be resistant to glyphosate, which is Roundup. And there were no riots in the streets. There were in other countries. There were in France. New Zealand never let them in. Other countries never let them in. But in the US, that actually never happened. So it turns out it was a brilliant strategy. It was an intentional strategy. It wasn't a closed-door conspiracy. They told people what they were doing, and then they did it.
Should there be riots in the streets?
It's interesting because now, my own personal perspective is shaped more from the health food business, health food person. And so from that standpoint, the health food conscious people, health food store shoppers, for example, are recently in the last 8 or 10 years waking up to the idea that this is almost all the food supply. And it's a little late. And now that it's a niche market, there's niche brands and niche companies that are chasing after it that people are flocking to. Non-GMO certified independently is a big deal now to consumers. But I remember this would have been the late 90s. I think Monsanto split off their chemicals business in like 97 or something like that, about 97. So after that, the crops were starting to come out, and we had customers. I was in charge of GNC at the time. We had customers calling in saying, I don't want genetically modified soybeans in my soy protein or growth hormone in my whey protein. And so I called our contact at Archer Daniels Midland. Remember, I'm running GNC, and I said, hey, we only want our soy protein to come from, from non-genetically modified. We don't want to experiment with this with our customers. Our customers don't want it. And they said, hey, Greg, that's great, but we can't ship you that. I said, well, why not? We're the biggest seller of this protein in the world for supplements. They said, no, we can't because it's deemed safe. We don't separate the soybeans that are GMO and the soybeans that are not in the silos when they store it. So when they go to process it, they don't know the difference. So this is the late 90s. It was already kind of intermingled into the food supply, and the idea of segregation, you had to wait a year so they could literally put it in a different grain silo. That's when I had a feeling that this was probably unstoppable. And at that time, the GM crops were only maybe, I don't know, 15-20% of the crops, not 90.
When you had that conversation, did it lead you to any particular action or any particular agenda that was different than before that conversation, when you had this realization, holy crap, this stuff is intermingled, you can't kind of unring the bell, what's going to happen?
Well, I mean, there's a selfish answer to that. For GNC's business, we ordered stuff a year out that was separated so that we'd have non-GMO protein powder from the stuff we wanted. So that was proactive business step. From a personal standpoint, I started seeking out products that didn't have that. I didn't want to do the experiment with myself. That certainly didn't stop it from taking over the broad marketplace. And I was really surprised that there wasn't the same kind of passion that people are bringing to it now, that it's a small fraction of foodstuffs can be, you have to do a special process and be independently validated through a service to show that it's non-GMO. Like, that used to just be called food.
Yeah.
Non-GMO food used to just be called food.
Right.
Not that long ago, 20 years ago. And so now people are looking for more real food, but the horses you can't unring the bell, as you mentioned. So all you can do as a person, if you care about this stuff, is actually just avoid it yourself and look for those independent seals and look for less processed food.
And it's interesting because you're saying, that used to be called food. Now we have to characterize food based on technology. And it's interesting too, because it seems very cultural. As you said, there are many areas of the world where they said, we don't allow GMO products to come in here. Yet where we are in North America, it's ubiquitous and it's almost inescapable. If you were to put on your crystal ball hat and gaze into it and say, where's this all going? Because there is this certain counterculture that's saying, we're very disturbed by this. There seems to be some malfeasance and conspiracy surrounding, the whole thing relative to Monsanto and other manufacturers and what their agendas are, et cetera. Where do you think this is going?
I think the genetically modified crops are here to stay. I mean, it's not just because of Monsanto making a $1.9 billion profit off pesticides and a $6.2 billion profit off the genetics of the seeds. A lot of crops don't go into food. So 40% of the US corn crop, for example, goes into the creation of fuel, ethanol that you burn in your tank. And another 36% or so of that last year went into feed. So feeding animals that need the grain.
What are some of the implications there?
Well, we'll get back to that in a second.
Okay.
So for human consumption, you're left with the other, whatever that is, 24%, I guess, of the corn goes into some kind of food crop. But 94%, I think, is GMO. So I think probably the best we can do now in terms of practical application for the food supply is to have genetically preserved foods be our human consumption foods. I don't think it matters quite that much whether the corn that we're growing is GM if you're going to burn it up anyway. I just like to see that segregated, and in my own personal life, that's what we try to do is segregate like the food quality stuff versus the stuff that's going into fuel. So the farmers can get a higher yield on fuel, but I'd really rather have something that's much more close to natural than genetically modified for the food side of it.
And this becomes a slippery slope though, right? Because you have kind of this crossover effect where, we have a field over here for fuel. And we're going to spray it like crazy, and we're going to, it's going to be GMO. But over here's the field that's for consumption. How do you try to create the separation when pretty much you can't because of winds blow and cross contamination of crops, and suddenly you've got a challenge or an issue. So, is there any proposed solution to that particular dilemma?
So first of all, this idea of cross-pollination is, you don't know that's an unintended consequence. Yeah. And there's been cross-pollination since the dawn of plants on the earth, right? They've always been cross-pollinating. The difference now is that you have a man-made insertion variant that's now cross-pollinating. And so that's got unknown
Yeah.
consequences. The idea of segregation of genetically modified and non-GMO foods is a really powerful one. And going back to the late 90s when we did that for GNC at the silo level with ADM, and they did it for us, all the way through to what we're doing in our own family, where we're demanding to have non-GM and more organic foods that we consume, that's very powerful. I think the awareness of non-GMO went through a little bit of a dip. So it was kind of under the radar, and then people kind of heard about it but didn't care, and now they're caring a lot. And that consumer demand and voting with your dollars on what you purchase is incredibly powerful at shaping markets and demand, because if farmers have more demand for non-GM crops, that's what they're going to plant, that's what they're going to grow. So
Right.
you got to tap into the economic systems. I don't think you're going to put the genie back in the bottle in terms of genetic engineering.
I want to circle back to something that you said earlier that really got my attention, because the genesis of something, the values out of which something is created, the intention, sort of infuses the spirit in it and sends it off into its future. And you said that the companies, especially Monsanto, I think you cited, that their original business was waging chemical warfare, and that they were literally waging chemical warfare on humans. So it was basically the United States government's involved in wars, World War II, Vietnam, large-scale wars, and these people were charged with the intention and the duty, if you will, to create chemicals that can kill human beings. So war sort of goes away, human-on-human war, and they say, well, let's now adjust our sights on something other than humans. Let's put it on plants, on pests, and wage chemical warfare there. And if you look at just the fundamental construct of the idea of waging a war, make it chemical warfare, and pointing at different types of species, not just humans, on the planet, doesn't the overall construct just seem like something that could be kind of radical and have long-term, very adverse, toxic, dangerous effects in the world?
So the chemical warfare metaphor is perfect. So there was these plants that were designed to make chemicals, and the war's over, and we need a new enemy.
Yeah.
And the new enemy is insects. The new enemy is weeds. And that's a legitimate enemy. And they repurposed those, both the chemistry knowledge as well as the productive capacity, towards killing a new enemy. And the new enemy was the things that ate our crops. And it worked. They are winning the war. So these chemicals are very effective at killing the bad stuff. And in the short term, that's what you care about, right? The question is, how do you win the peace? A war is a short-term phenomenon, hopefully. So what happens afterwards? And afterwards, we just kept using more and more of this, and we actually upped the ante to change the biological nature of the seed. This is life sciences, so that it would actually be more resistance to the chemical warfare.
Right.
Which brings up the question, now that we're in peacetime, what do those biological changes within the seed mean once you consume them in terms of your biology and the food supply? And what residual of that pesticide or herbicide that remains in the plant, what residual effect does that have on your own biology?
Thanks so much for being here and watching that video. And can I ask you to please subscribe to our channel so you can find out when we're posting new content. You'll be alerted right away when we do. To share this with people you think might benefit from the information, and certainly it helps us if you like the video. So if you like what you just saw, go ahead and hit that like button. And again, thank you so much for being here with me right now.